I placed the keys to my father's Gold Coast mansion on his desk. Beside them, I set the signed power of attorney, relinquishing my rights to the firm. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I gave a calm, polite smile and said, "Congratulations." The silence that followed was absolute. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked I had stopped playing along. Have you ever kept the ship afloat only to be told you were just a passenger? Let me know if you have walked away from a toxic legacy in the comments. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the culmination of a 6-year transaction, a business deal where I was the sole investor and they collected all the dividends. When the economic crash hit in 2020, my father's Denver architecture firm was bleeding capital. Bankruptcy wasn't a possibility. It was a scheduled event. I didn't panic. I didn't grieve. I simply stepped in and opened the ledger. For 6 years, I operated as the lead project manager, restructuring our debt, firing incompetent vendors, and saving the foundation of the company. My crowning achievement was the legacy project. It was a massive commercial development fraught with complex municipal zoning laws, environmental impact assessments, and rigorous structural hurdles. While my father played golf with investors, I was at my desk at 4 a.m, drafting emails to city planners, auditing blueprints, and ensuring we didn't violate a single municipal code. I was the silent partner in their version of family. While I audited those blueprints, my sister Chloe was living a very different reality. Chloe was a public relations specialist, which in our family meant she attended sponsored brunches and curated her social media feed. She spent the last 6 years traveling, posting aesthetic photos of lattes in Paris and sunsets in Bali, funded entirely by the dividends of the company I was keeping alive. She was the face of the family's success, while I was the engine. I used to think my father appreciated the sacrifice. I equated his reliance on my work with respect, but respect is a currency, and my father was completely bankrupt in it. I realized too late that my loyalty had simply been a subscription service, with me footing the bill every single month. I had sacrificed my 20s, my sleep, and my peace of mind to rebuild a firm that bore his name. I negotiated the high-stakes contracts. I secured the zoning permits for the legacy project. I did the grueling math when no one else wanted to look at the numbers. Every time the firm faced a crisis, I was the designated crisis manager. And every time Chloe needed funding for her aesthetic lifestyle, the firm miraculously found the budget. I didn't resent the work itself. I am an architect and a manager. Building and fixing are what I do best. But I absolutely resented the assumption that my competence was a limitless resource they could mine without compensation or title. I was never officially made a partner. I was never given equity. I was just the daughter who was useful. Chloe was the daughter who was loved. But in business, love doesn't balance the ledger. Only equity does. And I was about to audit their entire operation. The hostile takeover didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened over 8 weeks when Chloe returned to Denver. She breezed into the office with a new designer wardrobe and announced she was reinventing the company narrative. I watched from my desk as she replaced detailed structural timelines with superficial mood boards. Suddenly, my father was introducing her to our key clients as the future of the firm. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I was witnessing the competence curse in real time. It is a harsh operational truth. When you are flawlessly efficient, your struggles become completely invisible. Because I handled every zoning crisis, every budget deficit, and every vendor dispute without breaking a sweat, my father assumed the work was easy. My absolute competence erased the perception of difficulty. I had made saving the firm look so seamless that my father genuinely believed anyone could do it, even Chloe. He looked at her total lack of architectural experience and called it fresh vision. He looked at my 6 years of grueling, meticulous management and called it basic administration. The competence curse meant that my reliability had become my own prison. I had built a machine so perfect that the operators forgot they needed a mechanic. During a Monday morning briefing, my father officially announced that Chloe would be taking over the public leadership of the firm. He patted my shoulder and told me I was invaluable in the background, keeping the gears turning. He was attempting to demote me to an administrative assistant in the company I had salvaged. He wanted me to continue carrying the liability while Chloe received the equity, the title, and the applause. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to demand recognition. Arguing is a negotiation tactic, and I was no longer negotiating. I sat in that meeting, analyzing the shifting power dynamic with cold precision. They weren't just taking my position, they were attempting to rewrite history. Chloe confidently presented a glossy brochure for the legacy project, entirely bypassing the structural load requirements I had spent months finalizing. My father beamed at her presentation, blinded by the aesthetics and his own narcissism. I realized then that my father didn't want a lead project manager. He wanted a mascot, and he expected me to quietly clean up the messes behind the scenes. But a machine without its mechanic will eventually tear itself apart. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I watched them congratulate each other on a vision they didn't have the discipline to execute. They thought my silence was submission. It was actually calculation. I was already drafting their final invoice. I just needed to step back and let the gears grind until they shattered. The firm immediately began preparing for the annual shareholder dinner, an event designed to project absolute stability and success. It was the perfect stage for my father to formalize Chloe's new role and push me further into the shadows. As the date approached, I initiated a quiet, methodical review of our active files. That is when I found it. While I had been busy fixing the company's fiscal deficits on our secondary accounts, Richard had quietly allowed Chloe to take the absolute lead on the legacy project. He had explicitly bypassed my mandatory oversight protocols. I opened the digital blueprints and cross-referenced them with the municipal filings Chloe had submitted under his authorization. It was a masterclass in catastrophic negligence. This was the fatal flaw of prioritizing the illusion of presence over the reality of value. Chloe possessed the illusion of presence. She walked into client meetings with absolute aesthetic confidence, armed with beautiful rendering software, designer suits, and a persuasive smile. She looked exactly like what people thought a successful architect should look like. She spoke in buzzwords and promised visionary designs, but the reality of value is calculated in load-bearing columns, soil stability reports, concrete density, and rigid municipal compliance. Chloe's aesthetic confidence masked a complete architectural ignorance. She had fundamentally altered the structural supports in the underground parking facility to create a more open, airy aesthetic for the main lobby above. She had prioritized visual flow over fundamental physics. She possessed the illusion of leadership, but the reality of value dictates that gravity does not care about a beautiful mood board. By removing the reinforced pillars, she had compromised the structural integrity of the entire development. And Richard, blinded by his desperate desire to make his golden child the star of the firm, had signed off on the revisions without consulting the engineering team. I sat in my office staring at the screen. The math was indisputable. The load calculations were glaringly obvious. If built to Chloe's aesthetic specifications, the building would eventually fail. The liability wouldn't just be financial, it would be criminal. My father hadn't just handed her a promotion. He had handed her a ticking time bomb. I didn't rush to his office to warn him. I had spent 6 years being their safety net. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, always fixing their deficits and absorbing their risk. This time, I closed the file. I logged out of the server. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. They had demanded total control of the legacy project, and I was going to let them have it, along with every single legal consequence attached to it. I methodically backed up the unaltered files and the fraudulent revisions. The ledger was unbalanced, and the audit was coming. The legacy project wasn't just structurally compromised, it was legally lethal. I am methodical. I do not leave variables to chance. When I first noticed Richard bypassing my oversight protocols 2 months ago, I didn't complain. I simply initiated a secondary, deeply confidential audit of the firm's municipal compliance. I brought in Marcus, our lead legal counsel, and a specialist in Denver municipal law. Marcus is a man who deals exclusively in facts, precedents, and contracts, which made him the perfect partner for what needed to be done. Under Marcus's strict guidance, I compiled a comprehensive dossier of Chloe's unauthorized structural revisions and Richard's highly negligent approvals. Then, operating entirely within my legal fiduciary duty as the lead project manager, I filed anonymous reports with the Denver City Planning Department. I submitted the altered blueprints, the bypass safety protocols, and the forged environmental compliance forms Richard had rushed through. I did this months ago. The gears of municipal bureaucracy grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. I knew exactly when the city inspectors would conclude their investigation. The timing was a simple, beautiful mathematical equation. While Chloe was busy picking out imported floral arrangements for the shareholder dinner and my father was preparing his arrogant speech to announce her succession, the city was finalizing a massive, unassailable notice of violation. My father thought his attempt to hand the company to Chloe was a triumph of family legacy. He didn't realize he was actually handing her a direct path to a federal and municipal criminal investigation, zoning fraud, structural negligence, and willful endangerment of public safety. The fines alone would bankrupt the firm immediately. The criminal charges would ensure Richard and Chloe never worked in commercial real estate again. I organized the physical documents in a pristine manila folder on my desk. There was no panic in my chest, no racing heartbeat, no sudden surge of despair. Anger had been replaced by a cold, clinical precision. I had spent 6 years protecting my father from his own incompetence. I had built the firewall that kept his firm from burning down. Now, I was simply turning off the firewall. I reviewed the final injunction notices Marcus had securely obtained. Tomorrow at the shareholder dinner, Richard would stand in front of our investors and legally transfer the liability of the legacy project to Chloe. He would formally attach her name to the fraud. And I would sit at my assigned table, sip my sparkling water, and watch the transaction clear. They wanted the title. They were about to get the debt. I locked the dossier in my briefcase. The trap was set, not by malice, but by their own unchecked hubris. The annual shareholder dinner was held in the grand ballroom of the Brown Palace Hotel. The room was a sea of tailored suits, clinking crystal glasses, and superficial networking. I sat at table 4, perfectly composed, observing the metrics of my family's hubris. At 8 o'clock, Richard tapped his glass and walked confidently to the podium. He delivered a rehearsed, highly sentimental speech about the future, about fresh perspectives, and about the paramount importance of family. He formally announced that Chloe was taking over as the executive director of the Legacy Project. The shareholders applauded. Chloe smiled her curated photographic smile, waving to the crowd. Then, Richard looked directly at me. He announced that I would be stepping down from project management to take a much-needed sabbatical, effectively terminating my authority. He asked me to stand and accept the firm's gratitude. I stood, but I didn't smile. I walked calmly to the podium, carrying my pristine manila folder. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look at my sister. I looked directly at the shareholders. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the podium. It was my formal letter of immediate resignation. Richard's smile faltered instantly. "Elena, this isn't the time," he hissed under his breath. I ignored him entirely. I signaled to the back of the room where Marcus stood waiting. Marcus walked forward, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from celebratory to strictly legal. Richard tried to regain control, stating loudly into the microphone that any departure on my part was subject to the strict non-compete clause I had signed years ago. Marcus approached the microphone. He spoke with clinical, devastating detachment. He informed the shareholders that Richard had forced me to sign a non-compete agreement under the premise of a partnership that was never legally formalized. Because Richard had deliberately classified me as a standard W-2 employee rather than an equity partner to save money, the non-compete was fundamentally void. I was a free agent, effective immediately. A shocked murmur rippled through the ballroom, but the transaction wasn't complete. I stepped back to the microphone. I opened the folder and extracted a copy of the official Denver City Planning Department document. I announced that the Legacy Project had officially failed its municipal audit due to unauthorized, catastrophic structural alterations made by the new executive director, Chloe. I projected the stamped notice of violation onto the screens behind the podium. I detailed the zoning fraud, the structural compromises, and the impending criminal investigation initiated by the city. The room descended into absolute chaos. Investors grabbed their phones. Chloe's face drained of all color. Richard grabbed my arm, sheer panic replacing his arrogance. What have you done? He demanded. I didn't do anything, I replied, my voice steady and ice cold. I just stopped fixing your mistakes. This wasn't revenge, Richard. It was an audit. And you are bankrupt. I turned and walked out of the ballroom at exactly 8:15 in the evening. The retaliation was complete. The fallout from the dinner was swift and merciless. By Monday morning, the lead investors had pulled their funding from the legacy project. The city of Denver launched a full criminal probe into the firm's structural filings. Richard was immediately stripped of all executive authority by the emergency shareholder board. Chloe's influence vanished overnight. Her aesthetic mood boards were useless against federal indictments and subpoenaed blueprints. They were left to navigate the wreckage of the firm they had deliberately destroyed through their own negligence. I didn't stay to watch the demolition. I had already filed the paperwork for my own limited liability company. Within 48 hours of the dinner, every major client who knew I was the actual architect behind the firm's success transferred their contracts to my new independent agency. I had achieved the ultimate power of building without witness. For 6 years, I had worked in the shadows. I had operated without public applause, without social media posts, and without my father's validation. My family thought my silence was a sign of weakness. They thought, because I built without an audience, my work had no value. But building without witness is the absolute ultimate strategic advantage. Because no one was watching me, no one saw me gathering the city planners, securing the client loyalties, and laying the ironclad legal foundation for my own empire. While Chloe was busy performing success for the public, I was quietly, methodically constructing it. The silence wasn't a lack of power. It was the exact blueprint of my independence. I had built an impenetrable fortress right beneath their feet, and they only noticed it when I locked the doors and kept the keys. I have come to realize that walking away from the people who share your blood is the hardest structural revision you will ever make. I spent years trying to build a bridge to my father and sister, hoping that if I just worked hard enough, the foundation of our family would finally hold. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I don't carry anger anymore. Only the quiet, profound peace that comes from knowing my worth isn't tied to their ledger. True healing began the moment I stopped trying to save a house that was always meant to collapse and started building a warm, enduring home of my own. If you have made it this far, you know that the best revenge isn't a meltdown. It is a precise, successful exit. Tell me, what is one boundary you are setting for yourself this year? I will be reading the comments.